I tried to arrest the bench. Then one phone call turned me into the defendant.
Boyd, take off that robe. You don't get to hide behind it anymore. Today, you're not the law. I am. Those were the words that froze the air in courtroom 4 that rainy Tuesday morning. They didn't come from a defiant gang member. They didn't come from a desperate father losing custody of his children. They came from the man who was sworn to uphold the very Constitution that hangs on the wall behind me. I was sitting in my chair, reviewing a motion for a temporary restraining order. I am Judge Boyd. I have spent 20 years on this bench. I have looked into the eyes of murderers and seen remorse. I have looked into the eyes of liars and seen fear. But I have never looked into the eyes of a lawman and seen nothing but pure, unadulterated greed until Sheriff Huck the Hammer Miller walked through my doors. Sheriff Miller was a mountain of a man, 6'4", wearing a uniform that was tailored too tight, designed to intimidate. His badge didn't just shine, it glared under the courtroom lights. He didn't enter my courtroom like an officer of the court. He marched in like a warlord inspecting a conquered village. He was flanked by 3 deputies, all with hands resting casually, too casually on their holstered weapons. The sound in the room died instantly. The stenographer stopped typing. The public defender, a young woman named Sarah trying to argue a bail hearing, actually took a step back, clutching her files to her chest. You could hear the hum of the vending machine in the hallway. You could hear the heavy, rhythmic thud of Miller's combat boots on the hardwood floor. Thud, thud, thud. And I knew, right in that second, that the sanctity of this room was about to be violated. If you believe that a badge grants immunity from morality, you need to see how this began. My bailiff, huge man named Marcus, who usually stands like a statue, shifted his weight. I saw his hand twitch toward his radio, but Miller's deputies were already staring him down. It was a silent standoff before a word was even spoken. Sheriff Miller didn't stop at the bar. He pushed through the swinging gate, the gate that separates the public from the proceedings, the gate that represents respect for the process. He didn't look at the lawyers. He didn't look at the gallery. He looked straight at me. He was chewing gum, slow and deliberate, wearing sunglasses indoors. Sheriff Miller, I said, keeping my voice low, the kind of calm you force yourself to have when you see a storm cloud touching the ground. To what do I owe the pleasure of this interruption? We are in the middle of a session. Miller stopped at the defense table. He took off his sunglasses slowly, revealing eyes that were cold and bloodshot. He tossed the glasses onto the table with a clatter that echoed like a gunshot in the silent room. Session's over, Frank, he said, using my first name. A deliberate insult. In this room, I am your honor. We're shutting this circus down. And it starts with you vacating that seat. I leaned back. I adjusted my glasses. I wasn't aware that the sheriff's department had the authority to dissolve a judicial proceeding. I said, my voice hardening. Is there a fire, Sheriff? A bomb threat? Because unless the building is burning down, you are currently in contempt of court. Miller laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a dry, barking sound. He turned to the gallery, about 30 people, mostly citizens, waiting for traffic hearings or small claims. Clear the room, he shouted, his voice booming off the walls. Everyone out! Now! Unless you want to spend the night in the county lockup for obstruction. Panic rippled through the gallery. People grabbed their coats. An old woman dropped her purse, spilling coins everywhere, but she didn't stop to pick them up. They were terrified. This wasn't procedure. This was a raid. Sit down, I slammed my gavel. Bang. The sound was sharp, cutting through the fear. No one leaves this courtroom. This is a court of law, not your personal fiefdom, Sheriff. Bailiff, secure the doors. Marcus, my bailiff, stepped forward. Sheriff, you need to... One of Miller's deputies, a young man with a shaved head, shoved Marcus back. Hard. Back off, old man, the deputy sneered. That was the line. They had put hands on an officer of the court. I stood up. My chair scraped against the floor. Sheriff Miller, I shouted, my voice projecting the authority of 2 decades of service. You have 5 seconds to explain why your deputy just assaulted my bailiff, or I will have you all in chains before you can blink. Miller turned back to me. He smiled. It was a predator's smile. He reached into his belt. He didn't pull out a warrant. He didn't pull out a citation. He He pulled out a pair of steel handcuffs. They dangled from his finger, catching the light. You want an explanation, Boyd? Miller said, walking up the steps to the bench. Here it is. You've been asking too many questions about the Highway Seizure Fund. You've been signing too many subpoenas for my financial records. You think you're the hunter? He climbed the final step. He was towering over me now. The smell of stale tobacco and aggression was overwhelming. You're under arrest, Judge, he whispered, loud enough for the microphone to catch. For corruption, conspiracy, and resisting arrest. He reached for my arm. The metal of the handcuffs clicked open. The metal clicked. It wasn't just a sound, it was a severance. In that split second, the sheriff didn't just cuff a man. He tried to cuff the very concept of judicial independence. The steel bit into my wrist, cold and unforgiving. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the room, followed by a silence so profound you could hear the blood rushing in my own ears. You are making a mistake that you cannot unmake. Huck, I said. My voice didn't shake. I wouldn't give him that satisfaction. You are assaulting a sitting judge in open court. There is no qualified immunity for this. There is no badge big enough to cover this up. Miller didn't listen. He yanked my arm, pulling me forward so hard my chest hit the mahogany wood of the bench. Pain shot through my shoulder, but I kept my eyes locked on his. He leaned in close, his breath smelling of peppermint and stale coffee. Save the lecture for the cell block, Frank, he sneered. You think these people care about the law? They care about strength. And right now, you look weak. He spun me around, rough and theatrical, forcing me to face the gallery. My hands were behind my back, the robe bunching up awkwardly. It was a calculated humiliation. He wanted them to see their judge, their symbol of order, broken and restrained. Look at him, Miller bellowed to the terrified crowd. This is what corruption looks like, hiding in a robe, stealing your tax dollars while he lets criminals walk free. I'm doing this for you. I'm cleaning up this county. It was a lie. A bold, disgusting lie. But I saw something in the faces of the people in the back row that chilled me more than the handcuffs. Confusion, fear, and in a few eyes, doubt. Miller was playing to their anger, manipulating the narrative before the truth could even put its boots on. Marcus, I shouted, seeing my bailiff struggle to get up. The shaved-headed deputy had his hand on his taser, pointed right at Marcus's chest. Stand down. Do not give them a reason. That is an order. Marcus froze, his jaw tight, his fists clenched at his sides. He looked at me with agony in his eyes. He wanted to fight, but he knew, just as I did, that violence was exactly what Miller wanted. A scuffle would justify a shooting. A shooting would justify a cover-up. Smart move, Judge, Miller whispered in my ear. Then he shoved me, not toward the exit, but down the stairs. I stumbled, barely keeping my balance. A judge descending from the bench is usually a sign of recess. This was a descent into chaos. As I reached the floor level, standing where the defendants usually stand, the perspective shifted. The courtroom looked different from down here. It felt bigger, colder. I was no longer the authority. I was the accused. But Miller wasn't done. He didn't escort me out immediately. He wanted the crown. Slowly, deliberately, Sheriff Miller walked around the defense table. He walked up the steps to the bench, my bench. He ran his hand along the wood, possessed by a manic arrogance. Then, with a grin that made my stomach turn, he sat down in my chair. The leather creaked under his weight. He picked up my gavel. He held it like a weapon, not a tool. Now, Miller said, looking down at me from my own seat. This feels about right. The new order is in session. He pointed the gavel at me. Deputy, get this trash out of my courtroom. Take him to the booking processing. Maximum security holding. And make sure the press is waiting outside the back door. I want the world to see Judge Boyd in chains. As the deputies grabbed my arms, dragging me toward the side exit, I looked back one last time. I saw Miller spinning in my chair, laughing. He thought he had won. He thought he had decapitated the judicial system. But he had made one critical error. He let me keep my voice. And he forgot that before I was a judge, I was a prosecutor. And before that, I was a fighter. They dragged me into the hallway, the heavy doors swinging shut behind us, cutting off the view of the usurper on the throne. The hallway was empty, lined with portraits of past judges. They seemed to stare down in judgment, not at me, but at the disgrace walking beside me. Move it, the deputy hissed, tightening his grip on my bicep. I'm moving, I said, my mind racing a mile a minute. I needed a phone. I needed a witness. I needed a miracle. And then, as we turned the corner toward the holding cells, I saw him. It was District Attorney Reynolds, the man I had shared coffee with every Tuesday for 10 years, the man whose election campaign I had sworn in. He was standing by the water cooler, holding a file, looking pale. Arthur! I shouted, struggling against the deputy's grip. Arthur, tell them this is insanity. You know the law. You know they can't arrest a sitting judge without a grand jury indictment. Reynolds looked up. He didn't look shocked. He didn't look angry. He looked resigned. He shifted his weight, adjusted his tie, and then, slowly, he looked at the floor. It's out of my hands, Frank, he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. Sheriff says he has evidence. RICO statutes. Money laundering. It's a valid warrant. Valid? I laughed. A harsh, bitter sound. Since when does a sheriff sign his own warrant? Since when does the DA let a badge dictate the docket? He has something on you, doesn't he, Arthur? What is it? Gambling debts? Or is it something worse? The deputy yanked me forward. Shut up, Boyd. Save it for the jury. They dragged me past the man who was supposed to be the guardian of justice, leaving him staring at his shoes. That was the moment I realized this wasn't just a rogue sheriff. This was a coup. The entire courthouse had been compromised. They pushed me into the booking room. Usually, this room is a beehive of activity officers joking, arrestees pleading. Today, it was cleared out. Just Miller's loyalists. Strip him! Miller's voice boomed from the doorway. He had followed us down. He was leaning against the doorframe, still twirling my gavel in his hand. You want my robe? I asked, standing tall despite the handcuffs biting into my wrists. Take it. It's just polyester. You think the authority comes from the cloth? It comes from the oath. And I haven't broken mine. They tore the robe off my shoulders. They took my tie. They took my shoelaces. It is a process designed to dehumanize, to turn a man into an object. They shoved my fingers onto the ink pad. Press. Roll. Lift. My fingerprints, which usually signed orders of protection, were now being logged into the criminal database. Smile for the camera, Your Honor. The deputy with the shaved head sneered. Flash? I didn't smile. I stared into that lens with a look that promised a reckoning. I wanted that mugshot to be the last thing they saw before their careers turned to ash. Put him in holding cell 4, Miller ordered. Alone. I don't want him giving legal advice to the drunks. Cell 4. The isolation tank. It was a concrete box with a steel toilet and a bench bolted to the floor. It smelled of bleach and old misery. They shoved me in and slammed the heavy steel door. Clang. The sound of a lock turning is a sound you never forget. I sat on the cold bench. My wrists were raw. My heart was pounding against my ribs like a trapped bird. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. Think, Frank, think. Miller had the guns. He had the DA. He had the building. But he was arrogant. He was a bully who had never been told no. And bullies always make mistakes when they think they've won. 10 minutes later, the slot in the door slid open. Miller's eyes appeared. Comfortable, Frank? He taunted. I just got off the phone with the local news. They're running the headline now. Judge Boyd arrested in massive corruption sting. Your reputation is dead. By tomorrow morning, you'll just be another inmate looking for a plea deal. I stood up and walked to the door. You forgot one thing, Sheriff. Oh, yeah? Miller laughed. What's that? My Miranda rights? My phone call, I said, my voice steady as stone. Every detainee gets one phone call. It's in the handbook you wrote. Unless you plan on violating my civil rights on tape, in a building full of cameras you haven't had time to erase yet. Miller paused. I could see the gears turning. He knew denying the call would be a federal offense, the kind that brings in the FBI, not just local affairs. He smirked. He thought I was beaten. He thought I had no one left to call. The DA had turned. My staff was locked out. My wife was out of state. Fine, Miller said. Open it up. Give him the phone. Let him call his lawyer. Let him cry to his mommy. It won't matter. The door buzzed open. The deputy handed me a receiver attached to the wall in the hallway. Miller stood 3 feet away, arms crossed, listening. He wanted to hear me beg. I picked up the receiver. My fingers hovered over the keypad. I didn't dial a lawyer. I didn't dial my wife. I didn't dial the governor. I dialed a number I had memorized 20 years ago. A number for a man who owed me a life. The phone rang. It was a hollow, lonely sound in that concrete hallway. 1 ring, 2 rings. Sheriff Miller leaned against the wall, picking his teeth with a toothpick, watching me with the amusement of a cat playing with a half-dead mouse. "Who you calling, Frank?" Miller chuckled. "The Supreme Court? Maybe the Ghostbusters? Nobody is coming for you. The roads are blocked. My deputies are controlling the perimeter. We are an island. 3 rings. Click. A voice answered. It wasn't a secretary. It wasn't a voicemail. It was a voice that sounded like gravel crunching under a boot. "This line is for emergencies only. Identify." I didn't waste time with pleasantries. I didn't say hello. I looked straight into Miller's eyes as I spoke into the receiver. "This is Frank Boyd. Authorization code Delta 9 actual. The Eagle has landed in the nest. I repeat, the Eagle has landed in the nest. Execute Protocol 0. There was a pause on the other end, a pause that felt like a lifetime. Then, a single word. Understood. Click. The line went dead. I hung up the phone slowly. I didn't slam it. I placed it back on the cradle with the precision of a man closing a ledger. Miller burst out laughing. It was a loud, raucous sound that bounced off the steel bars. "Delta 9? The Eagle? What is this? A Tom Clancy novel? You really have lost it, old man. You think speaking in code makes you scary? It makes you look senile." He walked over and grabbed my shoulder, spinning me around. "Protocol 0? Let me guess. That's the protocol where you sit in a cell until you rot?" "Protocol 0, I said, my voice dropping to a whisper that cut through his laughter, "is the protocol for when the local law enforcement has become a domestic threat. It means you're not just a sheriff anymore, Huck. You're a target." Miller's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. Just a flicker of doubt in those cold eyes. But his ego was too big to let it stay. He shoved me toward the cell. "Get him out of my sight," he barked at the shaved-headed deputy. "No food, no water. Let him think about his protocols in the dark." They threw me back into cell 4. I stumbled, hitting my knee against the metal cot, but I didn't cry out. I sat down. I smoothed my shirt. I took a deep breath of the stale air. Miller stood outside the bars for a moment, gripping the steel with his large, hairy hands. "You know, Frank, I almost feel bad for you. You spent your whole life building this reputation, the Iron Judge. And it took me one afternoon to tear it down. Tomorrow, I'm appointing Judge Holloway to your seat. He knows how to play ball." "Holloway is a drunk," I said calmly. "Holloway is loyal," Miller corrected. "And in my county, loyalty is the only law that matters." He turned on his heel and marched away, his boots echoing down the corridor. Thud, thud, thud. The deputies followed him like obedient dogs, leaving me alone in the silence. But it wasn't silent. Not really. If you listened closely, you could hear the hum of the ventilation system. You could hear the distant drip of a leaking pipe. And in my mind, I could hear a clock ticking. Miller thought I was calling a friend. He thought I was calling a favor. He didn't know that for the last 6 months, I hadn't just been signing subpoenas. I had been building a case. I knew about the skim drug money. I knew about the civil asset forfeiture that bought his new boat. I knew about the intimidated witnesses. And the man I called? He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. He was the special agent in charge of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. And Protocol 0 wasn't a code from a movie. It was the signal that the evidence was secure, the trap was set, and the bait me had been taken. I sat in the dark, and for the first time that day, I smiled. Miller thought he had locked me in. In reality, he had just locked himself inside a cage with a lion he couldn't see. Hours passed. The shadows in the cell lengthened. I didn't sleep. I waited. I listened for the sound that I knew was coming. The sound that is louder than a gavel, louder than a gunshot. The sound of judgment arriving from above. While I sat in the dark of cell 4, counting the drips from the leaking pipe, Sheriff Huck Miller was upstairs. He was sitting in my chair in my chambers, with his muddy boots resting on my mahogany desk. He had opened a bottle of vintage scotch that my wife had given me for my 20th anniversary on the bench, a bottle I was saving for retirement. He poured it into a paper cup and toasted the air. To the new administration, Miller laughed, clinking his cup against the deputy's soda can. Boyd is done. By morning, the papers will be running the story about his mental breakdown. We'll say he snapped, attacked an officer. Sad, really. The shaved-headed deputy, whose name was Stone, grinned nervously. You sure the feds won't sniff around? Boyd had friends in high places. Friends? Miller scoffed. In politics, you don't have friends. You have leverage. And I have enough dirt on the governor to keep the National Guard in their barracks until next Christmas. Relax, Stone. We are untouchable. He took a sip of the scotch. He didn't taste the peat or the oak. He only tasted power. But that taste was about to turn to ash in his mouth. It started as a vibration, subtle at first. The liquid in Miller's paper cup began to ripple. Then, the framed diploma on my wall, the one from Harvard Law, tilted slightly. What is that? Stone asked, looking at the ceiling. Thunder? Miller frowned. He walked to the window, the heavy velvet drapes I kept drawn to keep the room cool. He pulled them back. He expected to see a storm. He expected to see rain lashing against the glass. He didn't expect to see a Black Hawk helicopter hovering at eye level, its rotors churning the air into a frenzy. The sound hit them a second later, a deafening roar that shook the very foundations of the courthouse. Thwup, 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 thwup. The glass in the window pane vibrated so violently it cracked down the middle. What the hell? Miller shouted, dropping his cup. The scotch spilled across my desk, soaking into the case files he had planned to burn. Down in the cell, I felt it too. Dust fell from the ceiling onto my shoulders. The concrete floor hummed beneath my feet. I stood up. I walked to the bars. The other inmates were screaming, banging on their doors, terrified that the building was coming down. Quiet, I yelled, my voice cutting through the panic. Listen, that isn't an earthquake. That is the cavalry. Upstairs, the radio on Miller's belt exploded with static and screaming voices. Sheriff, we have vehicles breaching the perimeter, black SUVs, no markings. They just rammed the gate. Who is it? Miller screamed into the radio. State troopers? Tell them to stand down. This is my jurisdiction. It's not the troopers, Sheriff. The voice on the radio cracked, filled with terror. It's, oh God, they're everywhere. They have FBI on their vests. They have a tank. They're breaching the front doors. Miller stared out the window. Below, in the courthouse square, it looked like a war zone. Armored personnel carriers were tearing up the lawn. Dozens of agents in tactical gear were swarming the steps, moving with a precision that made Miller's deputies look like mall cops. Lock it down, Miller roared, his face turning a sickly shade of pale. Stone, get the boys, barricade the doors. No one gets in, no one gets out. But Sheriff, Stone stammered, backing away. That's the FBI. If we fight them, that's treason. That's a death sentence. Miller pulled his service pistol. He pointed it at his own deputy. The mask of the confident lawman was gone. Beneath it was a cornered, rabid animal. I said, lock it down, Miller screamed, spittle flying from his lips. We hold the judge hostage. He's our ticket out. Go down there and get him. Bring him up here. If they breach the doors, Boyd is the first one to bleed. Stone ran. He scrambled out of the chambers, his boots slipping on the polished floor. Miller turned back to the window. A loudspeaker boomed from outside, a voice amplified to godlike proportions, echoing off the surrounding buildings. Sheriff Huck Miller, this is Special Agent Reynolds of the FBI. The building is surrounded. You have violated federal law under the color of authority. Surrender now, or we will breach. Miller looked at my desk. He looked at the handcuffs he had used on me. He looked at the gun in his hand. He wasn't going to surrender. He had come too far. He had committed too many sins. He grabbed the radio. Anyone comes through those doors, you open fire. Do you hear me? Open fire. Down in the cell block, the lights flickered and died. The power had been cut. We were in total darkness. But in the silence that followed, I heard the heavy steel door at the end of the corridor, the door that led to freedom, being unlocked. But it wasn't the FBI. It was Deputy Stone, breathless and terrified, coming to use me as a human shield. The beam of the flashlight cut through the darkness like a frantic, erratic blade. It danced across the concrete walls, the steel bars, and finally landed on my face, blinding me. Behind the light, I could hear the heavy, ragged breathing of Deputy Stone. He was hyperventilating. "Get up!" Stone screamed, his voice cracking. "Get up, Judge! We're moving! Now!" The cell door buzzed and slid open. Stone stepped in. He had his service weapon drawn, but his hands were shaking so violently that the barrel of the gun was vibrating. He wasn't a killer. He was a kid from the suburbs who thought a badge would give him respect. Now, he was holding a gun on a judge in the middle of a federal siege. I didn't stand up immediately. I sat on the bench, shielding my eyes from the light. "Put the light down, son," I said. My voice was calm, almost bored. It was the voice I used when a lawyer was making a frivolous objection. "You are blinding the court." "Did you hear me?" Stone yelled, taking a step closer. Miller said, "To bring you up. If I don't, he'll kill me. He said he'd kill me." "Then what do you think the FBI will do when they breach that door?" I asked, slowly rising to my feet. I held my hands out, showing the cuffs. "Look at the window, Stone. Look outside. There are snipers on the roof across the street. There are agents with thermal imaging scopes aimed at this building right now. They can see the heat signature of that gun in your hand." Stone froze. He looked at the gun as if it were a venomous snake. "If you drag me out of here," I continued, stepping into the light, "if you use me as a shield, you are no longer a deputy. You are an enemy combatant, and they will not hesitate to neutralize the threat. Is that how you want your mother to see you on the news tonight? In a body bag?" Stone lowered the gun slightly. The light dipped to the floor. I was just following orders." "Illegal orders are not orders," I said, my voice hardening. "They are crimes. Huck Miller is finished. He is a dead man walking. He is trying to take you down with him to buy himself 5 more minutes of freedom. Don't be his collateral damage." Above us, a massive explosion rocked the building. Boom. Dust rained down from the ceiling. The sound of shattering glass and shouting voices echoed down the elevator shaft. The breach had begun. The FBI was in the lobby. "They're inside," Stone whimpered, backing against the wall. "Oh God, they're inside. Give me the keys," I said. I didn't ask. I commanded. I held out my cuffed hands. Stone looked at me. He looked at the door. He looked at the gun. Then, with a sob, he holstered the weapon. He fumbled at his belt, his fingers slippery with sweat, and pulled out the key ring. He unlocked the cuffs. The metal clicked open. I rubbed my wrists. The blood rushed back into my hands, bringing a sharp, stinging pain, but it felt like victory. "Stay here," I ordered Stone. "Sit on that bench. Keep your hands visible. When the agents come down, you tell them you surrendered. You tell them Judge Boyd sent you." Stone collapsed onto the bench, burying his face in his hands. He was done. I walked out of the cell. I walked into the booking room. The other deputies had fled, running to barricade the upper floors or trying to find a back exit that didn't exist. The room was empty, save for the hum of the emergency lights. I saw Miller's radio sitting on the desk where he had left it. It was crackling with chaos. "Sheriff, they're using tear gas. We can't hold the stairs. Where are you?" I picked up the radio. I pressed the transmit button. "He's not coming," I said. My voice was projected to every radio in the building, to every deputy, and to Miller upstairs in my chambers. There was a moment of silence on the frequency. Then, Miller's voice came back, breathless and filled with rage. "Boyd." "Stone, you idiot. I told you to bring him to me. Stone is in custody," I said, walking toward the elevator. "My custody. And now, Huck, I'm coming for you. Not as a hostage, but as the presiding judge of this circuit. You come up here, and I'll blow your head off," Miller screamed. "I have the high ground. I have the hostages. I have your clerk." My blood ran cold. My clerk, Sarah. She was supposed to be on vacation. She must have come in to file the motions. He had her. "Let her go, Huck," I said, pressing the call button for the elevator. The door slid open. "This is between you and me. Come and get her," Miller hissed. I stepped into the elevator. I didn't have a weapon. I didn't have a badge. All I had was the truth and 20 years of righteous anger. I pressed the button for the top floor. The The doors closed. The elevator began to rise. The elevator chimed. It was a cheerful, polite sound that had no business being in a war zone. The doors slid open to the top floor, revealing a hallway choked with smoke. The emergency sprinklers had been triggered, and water rained down in a steady, gray drizzle, turning the carpet into a swamp. I stepped out. My shoes squelched on the wet floor. I didn't run. I walked. I straightened my spine. I was unarmed, soaking wet, and exhausted. But as I walked toward the heavy oak doors of my chambers, I felt the weight of the robe I wasn't wearing. "Miller!" I shouted. "I'm here!" There was no answer, only the sound of sirens wailing outside, a chorus of judgment encircling the building. I pushed the doors open. The room was a wreck. The window I had looked out of for 20 years was shattered, the curtains flapping wildly in the rotor wash of the helicopter still hovering outside. Files were scattered everywhere, thousands of pages of case law, now just wet confetti. And there, behind my desk, was Sheriff Huck Miller. He had one arm wrapped around the neck of Sarah, my court clerk. She was 24 years old, terrified, mascara running down her cheeks. In his other hand, Miller held his service pistol, pressed tight against her temple. "Stop right there!" Miller screamed. His eyes were wide, manic. He looked like a man who had stared into the abyss and found it laughing back at him. "I'll do it, Frank. I swear to God, I'll paint this wall." I stopped. I raised my hands slowly, palms open. "Let her go, Huck. She's a civilian. She records dockets. She doesn't carry a gun. She isn't part of your war. She's leverage," Miller spat. "Get that chopper to land. Tell them to clear the roof. I want a pilot, and I want a flight plan to a non-extradition country, or Sarah doesn't go home." Sarah whimpered, her eyes pleading with me. "Judge, please." "It's okay, Sarah," I said, my voice steady. "Look at me. Just look at me. Don't look at him." I took a step forward. Miller flinched, tightening his grip. I said, "Back off," he roared. "There is no chopper, Huck," I said, taking another step. "There is no pilot. There is no flight plan. Look out that window. Look at what you've done." Miller risked a glance. Through the shattered glass, the red and blue lights of 100 police cars illuminated the rain like a strobe light. "You see that?" I asked. "That isn't just the FBI. That's the state police. That's the National Guard. That's your own deputies down there, Huck. They've surrendered. Stone gave up. The barricade is gone. You are the only one left." "You're lying," Miller shouted, waving the gun. For a split second, the barrel moved away from Sarah's head and pointed at me. "My boys are loyal. They know I'm the only thing standing between order and chaos." "Loyalty?" I scoffed. "You think fear is loyalty? You think a paycheck is loyalty?" They turned on you the second the first federal boot hit the pavement. They are down there right now, cutting deals, telling the agents about the drug money, the extortion, the bodies you buried in the swamp. Miller's face twisted. The reality was cracking his delusion. I am the sheriff. I am the law in this county." "You were the sheriff," I corrected. "Now you're just a suspect in a barricade situation. And let me tell you how this ends, Huck. It doesn't end on a beach in Mexico. It ends in one of two ways." I took another step. I was 10 feet away now. "Option 1, I said, holding up one finger. "You pull that trigger. You kill an innocent girl. And 3 seconds later, that sniper across the street puts a 308 round through your brainstem. You die a monster, and your family changes their name out of shame." Miller was breathing hard, sweat stinging his eyes. He looked at the window, then back at me. "Or," I said, holding up a second finger, "option 2. You put the gun down. You let her go. You walk out of here in cuffs. You stand trial. You face me or whoever replaces me like a man. At least then you get to tell your side of the story." "My side?" Miller laughed, a broken, desperate sound. "Who's going to listen to my side? You rigged the system, Boyd. You and your Protocol Zero. You set me up." "I didn't set you up, Huck," I said softly. "I just turned on the lights. And you were the one afraid of what we'd see." Miller's hand was shaking uncontrollably now. The gun wavered. He looked at Sarah. He looked at me. He looked at the badge on his chest, the badge he had tarnished beyond repair. "I can't go to prison, Frank," he whispered. You know what they do to cops inside. I won't last a week. That's a choice you made when you put those cuffs on me, I said. Now make the next one. Put the gun down. The room was silent, save for the chopper blades outside. The tension was a physical weight, pressing down on us. I saw his finger tighten on the trigger. He wasn't going to surrender. He was going to take the coward's way out, but he wasn't going to take Sarah with him. Not on my watch. Huck! I shouted, my voice booming like a gavel strike. Look at me! He looked. And in that split second of distraction, the door behind him, the private bathroom door he hadn't checked, burst open. Flashbang. The world turned white. A sound louder than thunder erupted from the small bathroom. A concussive blast that sucked the air right out of the room. It wasn't a bullet. It was a distraction. A calculated, stunning grenade thrown by the FBI tactical team that had silently rappelled down the side of the building and entered through the vent. Miller didn't have time to think. He screamed, dropping the gun and clutching his ears. His equilibrium shattered. In that split second of blindness, Sarah didn't wait to be saved. She drove her elbow back into Miller's stomach, hard, and scrambled away across the wet floor. Secure, secure, secure. 3 agents in black tactical gear poured out of the bathroom like smoke. They didn't hesitate. One kicked the gun away. Another tackled Miller, driving him face first into the sodden carpet. The third shielded Sarah with his body, his weapon trained on the sheriff. Don't move, hands behind your back, do it now. Miller struggled for a second, a final, pathetic attempt to fight the inevitable. But the weight of 3 federal agents and the weight of his own crimes pinned him down. I watched as they grabbed his wrists. I watched as they pulled his arms back. Click, the sound of handcuffs closing, the same sound that had started this nightmare in my courtroom downstairs. But this time, it sounded different. It didn't sound like tyranny. It sounded like justice. Sheriff Huck Miller, Agent Reynolds said, stepping through the broken door, his weapon lowered, but his eyes hard as flint. You are under arrest for racketeering, kidnapping, assault on a federal officer, and treason against the state. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you use it. Miller didn't speak. He looked up from the floor, his face pressed against the wet carpet, his uniform ruined. He looked at me. His eyes were no longer arrogant. They were empty. The hammer had been broken. Get him up, Reynolds ordered. They hauled Miller to his feet. He couldn't look me in the eye. He looked at the floor, at the shattered glass, at the wreckage of the office he had tried to steal. Judge Boyd, Reynolds said, nodding to me. We're clearing the building. The threat is neutralized. Your department, what's left of it, is secure. I walked over to where Miller stood. I didn't yell. I didn't gloat. I reached down to my desk, pushed aside the spilled scotch and the broken glass, and picked up something he had left there. My gavel. I weighed it in my hand. It felt heavy. It felt right. You said you wanted the world to see a judge in chains, I said to Miller, my voice low and steady. Well, take a look, Huck. The cameras are waiting outside, but they aren't here for me. Miller opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to beg, perhaps to threaten one last time, but no words came out. He slumped his shoulders, defeated. Get him out of my chambers, I ordered. They dragged him away, out the door, down the hall, toward the elevator that would take him to the very cell he had thrown me in. I watched him go until the doors slid shut. I turned to Sarah. She was sitting on a chair, wrapped in an FBI blanket, shaking. I walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. Go home, Sarah, I said gently. Take the week off. You did good. She looked up, tears in her eyes. Judge? Is it over? I looked out the shattered window. The rain had stopped. The sun was trying to break through the clouds, illuminating the chaos below the police cars, the news vans, the people of the county watching their king being dethroned. Yes, I said. It's over. I walked back to my desk. I sat down in my leather chair. It was wet. It was cut by glass, but it was mine. I looked at the phone, the simple, black landline sitting on the corner of the desk. The cord was cut, sliced by Miller in his rage, but it didn't matter. The call had been made. People think power comes from a badge. They think it comes from a gun, or a title, or a customized uniform. But they are wrong. Power comes from the truth. And when you try to handcuff the truth, when you try to lock it in a dark cell, it doesn't die. It just makes a phone call. I am Judge Boyd. This is my courtroom. And court is adjourned.